For an Allied gunner in World War II, combat at 25,000 feet was a special kind of hell. Imagine the piercing shriek of the wind, temperatures plunging to 50 below zero, and the constant bone-rattling vibration of a .50 caliber machine gun bucking in your frozen hands. You were a knight in an aluminum castle, but your armor was just a flimsy sheet of metal, and the dragons you fought spat cannon shells. This was the world of the B-17 Flying Fortress, a world of raw guts and unimaginable hardship, where you measured your life in seconds. But while those crews were fighting and dying over Europe, a top-secret weapon was being forged in the heart of America. An airplane so advanced, so radically different, it felt like it belonged to another time entirely. A bomber that promised its crew pressurized cabins like an airliner, and guns they could aim and fire by remote control, all guided by an incredible analog computer. It sounded like something out of a science fiction pulp magazine. For the battle-hardened crews who first saw it, it was almost impossible to believe it was real. This is the story of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the $3 billion gamble that created the most complex and powerful weapon of the war. It's the story of a technological marvel that left its own crews shaking their heads in disbelief, how its game-changing power was finally unleashed to bring an empire to its knees. By 1943, the war in the Pacific was defined by one single massive problem: distance. The vast, empty expanses of the Pacific Ocean were a tyrant, dictating every single strategic decision. The island-hopping campaign led by Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur was clawing its way across the sea. But the ultimate target, the Japanese home islands, remained stubbornly out of reach, and the workhorse of the American air fleets. The tough old B-17 Flying Fortress was a master of the skies over Europe. It could take a beating and deliver a punch, but in the Pacific, its range was a fatal flaw. With a combat radius of about 1,000 miles, it simply couldn't make the round trip from existing Allied bases to the industrial heart of Japan. A new kind of weapon was needed. Not just a small improvement, but a total revolution in aeronautical engineering. The strategic planners in Washington, D.C. drew up a wish list that sounded less like an engineering proposal and more like a fantasy. They needed a bomber that could fly over 5,000 miles, carrying a heavier bomb load than anything before it. It had to cruise above 30,000 feet in the thin, cold air far above the reach of most enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns. It had to do all this at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, making it almost as fast as the fighters sent to shoot it down. The challenge was staggering. At the time, no aircraft on Earth came close to those numbers. The engines needed to lift such a monster to those altitudes at that speed didn't exist yet. The defensive systems needed to protect it on a solo journey deep into enemy territory were purely theoretical. And the idea of keeping a crew of 11 men alive, let alone effective for missions lasting over 15 hours in the stratosphere, was an engineering nightmare. The project, codenamed the XB-29, became the most expensive and ambitious undertaking of the entire war. Before it was all over, the United States would pour over $3 billion into its development. To put that in perspective, the Manhattan Project, the secret program to build the atomic bomb, cost $2 billion. America was literally betting more on the delivery truck than on the package itself. It was a gamble on a scale never seen before, a desperate push to build a machine that could solve the impossible problem of the Pacific and win the war. When the first B-29 Superfortresses began rolling off the assembly lines, the crews assigned to them were just stunned. They were looking at an airplane, but it felt like they were staring at the future. It was a sleek silver behemoth, its polished aluminum skin smooth and unbroken by the familiar gunner's blisters of older bombers. With a wingspan of 141 feet and a length of 99 feet, it dwarfed the B-17. But it wasn't just the size that was so shocking. It was the technology inside a collection of revolutionary systems that felt a decade ahead of their time. The first, and maybe the most profound change, was something the crews felt the moment they stepped inside: pressure. The B-29 was the first bomber ever with fully pressurized crew compartments. For years, bomber crews had suffered through the agony of high-altitude flight. They worked in unheated open-air sections where temperatures hit 60 below zero. They wore bulky, electrically heated flight suits that often failed and breathed through clumsy oxygen masks that froze over. Frostbite was a constant enemy, and sheer exhaustion was a guarantee. The superfortress changed all that. Two main pressurized sections, the cockpit area up front and the gunners. Compartment in the middle were kept at a comfortable cabin altitude. Third separate pressurized compartment was way back in the tail for the tail gunner. For the first time, a crew could fly a 15-hour mission at 30,000 feet wearing little more than a standard uniform. This wasn't about luxury. It was a revolution in combat effectiveness. Crews were less tired, more alert, and could operate at their best for the entire mission. Connecting the forward and aft pressurized sections was another bit of unbelievable engineering. A 34-foot-long padded tunnel that ran over the unpressurized bomb bays. A crewman could literally crawl from the front of the plane to the back mid-flight. That simple act was completely impossible on any other bomber of the era and did wonders for morale. But if the pressurized cabin was a revelation, the defensive system was pure science fiction. This was the part that made even seasoned engineers shake their heads. The superfortress was armed with 12 50-caliber machine guns, housed in 5 remote-controlled turrets, 2 on top, 2 on the bottom, and 1 in the tail. Unlike on a B-17, where a gunner stood behind his weapon exposed to the elements, B-29 gunners sat in relative comfort and safety. They operated from sighting stations, aiming a sophisticated targeting device instead of the gun itself. When a gunner tracked an enemy fighter in his sight, a revolutionary analog computer, the General Electric Central Fire Control System, took over. This mechanical brain, a dizzying maze of gyroscopes, motors, and wiring, instantly calculated a perfect firing solution. It factored in the B-29's airspeed, the outside temperature, gravity, and, most importantly, the exact lead needed to hit a fast-moving target. The computer then sent electrical signals to the turrets, aiming and firing the guns with a precision no human could ever hope to match. The system was miraculous. A single gunner could, with the flick of a switch, control multiple turrets at once, concentrating a devastating storm of fire on an attacker. It meant the B-29 didn't really need a fighter escort. It was its own escort, a flying battleship bristling with computer-guided cannons. Powering this technological marvel were 4 Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines, the most powerful and complex aircraft engines of their day. Each 18-cylinder behemoth produced a staggering 2,200 horsepower, giving the B-29 a top speed over 350 miles per hour. But these engines were notoriously temperamental, prone to overheating and catching fire, earning the plane the grim nickname, the $1 Million Lighter. When they worked, though, they provided the raw power needed to hurl the 135,000-pound bomber into the stratosphere. Everything about the B-29 was a step into the future. It was an instrument of war so advanced that its own crews struggled to wrap their heads around it. It wouldn't have to wait long to see the devastating proof of what it could do. The first B-29s arrived in the China-Burman India Theater in the spring of 1944. The plan, Operation Matterhorn, was to fly the bombers from bases in India, refuel at forward airfields in China, and then strike the Japanese mainland. It was a logistical nightmare. Every drop of fuel, every bomb, and every spare part had to be flown over the treacherous Himalayan mountains. An operation known as Flying the Hump. The crews, still getting the hang of their complex new planes, were ordered to put the high-altitude, daylight precision bombing doctrine to the test. The theory was simple. Fly high above the flak, use the advanced Norden bomb sight for surgical accuracy, and let the computerized guns handle any Japanese fighters. In reality, it was a disaster. The first missions against Japan were almost completely ineffective. The biggest problem was an invisible enemy, the jet stream. At 30,000 feet, the B-29s ran into powerful, unpredictable winds blowing over 200 miles per hour, which threw off their bomb sights and made accurate bombing impossible. Bombs scattered harmlessly. On top of that, the B-29s themselves were still buggy. The powerful Wright engines kept overheating on the long climbs, leading to catastrophic in-flight fires. Losses started to mount not just from enemy fire, but from mechanical failure. The billion-dollar gamble was on the verge of becoming a billion-dollar bust. The crew's initial awe was turning into frustration and fear. The science fiction plane was failing its first real-world test. Something had to change. Something drastic, brutal, and controversial. And that something came in the form of a man, Major General Curtis LeMay. May was a hard cigar-chomping realist who had commanded B-17s over Germany. He knew the bloody price of daylight precision bombing. When he took over the 21 Bomber Command in the newly captured Mariana Islands in January 1945, he had a fleet of the world's most advanced bombers that weren't getting the job done. The Mariana Islands like Guam, Tinian, and Saipan had solved the distance problem. But the high-altitude strategy still wasn't working. LeMay looked at the data from the failed raids and came to a radical conclusion, decided to throw out the entire playbook the B-29 was designed for. On the night of March 9, 1945, LeMay ordered the most audacious air raid in history. He told his crews they wouldn't be flying at 30,000 feet. They would be flying at 5,000 feet, right into the teeth of Tokyo's defenses. They wouldn't be flying in a tight formation during the day, but as single planes at night. And they wouldn't be dropping high-explosive bombs on factories. They would be dropping thousands of small M69 incendiary bombs, designed for one purpose: to start fires. Then came the most shocking order of all. He had the bombers stripped of most of their guns and ammunition. The B-29's revolutionary defensive system was to be left on the ground. Only the tail guns remained. LeMay was making a cold, calculated bet. By flying low and fast at night, he gambled they could slip past most of the Japanese fighters. Dawn. By stripping the guns, the B-29's could carry a much heavier bomb load and use less fuel, reducing the strain on those temperamental engines. His own staff was horrified. They told him it would be a massacre. The crews were terrified. They felt like they were being sent to their deaths, stripped of their best defense. But LeMay wouldn't budge. He knew Japanese cities were built of wood and paper. He wasn't just going to destroy factories. He was going to burn Japan's paper cities to the ground. That night, 334 B-29's took off from the Marianas and descended on Tokyo. The result was an apocalypse. The incendiaries worked exactly as planned, creating a firestorm of unimaginable intensity. An estimated 100,000 people were killed in a single night. More than the initial death tolls of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, 16 square miles of the city were simply gone. The B-29 had finally found its purpose. Game Changer had revealed its terrible, terrible power. The Tokyo firebombing wasn't a one-off. It was the beginning of a relentless and horrifyingly effective campaign. LeMay's brutal tactic had worked. The low-altitude, nighttime incendiary raid became the new standard. Night after night, fleets of B-29's lifted off from Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, their bomb bays filled with the tools of inferno. The crews, once terrified, now flew with grim purpose. The reduced weight and lower altitude dramatically improved the plane's performance. Engine failures became less common. And, most importantly, losses were a fraction of what they had been on the high-altitude missions. LeMay's gamble had paid off. Over the next 5 months, the B-29's systematically erased Japan's cities. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe one by one, they were gutted by fire. By mid-June, large portions of Japan's 6 biggest cities had been incinerated. At the same time, B-29's dropped thousands of sea mines into Japan's harbors, blockading the island nation and strangling its war economy. The science fiction bomber had become the most devastating conventional weapon in history. But the final, world-altering demonstration of the B-29's power was yet to come. While the firebombing campaign raged, a far more secret operation was underway. A special unit, the 509th Composite Group, was training in isolation under Colonel Paul Tibbets. Their B-29's, codenamed Silverplate, were heavily modified for a single mission. The bomb bays were altered to carry one enormous weapon. Most of the turrets and armor were removed to save weight. They had new fuel-injected engines, advanced electronics, and special reversible propellers to help slow the massive planes down on landing. These were the planes chosen to carry the atomic bomb. Crews practiced a strange maneuver over and over, a high-speed bombing run followed by a gut-wrenching 155-degree diving turn. They didn't know why. They just knew they had to get away from the target as fast as humanly possible. On August 6, 1945, they found out. At 2:45 a.m., a Silverplate B-29 named the Enola Gay, piloted by Tibbets himself, lifted off from Tinian. In its bomb bay was a little boy. The target was Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the bomb was released from over 31,000 feet. The Enola Gay executed its violent escape maneuver. 43 seconds later, the sky was torn apart by a light brighter than the sun. The shock wave slammed into the retreating bomber, but its airframe held. Below them, a mushroom cloud boiled into the heavens. An estimated 70,000 people were killed in an instant. The B-29 had delivered the dawn of the atomic age. 3 days later, it happened again. Another B-29, the boxcar, took off with the second bomb. Fat Man. The primary target, Kokura, was hidden by clouds. The bomber diverted to its secondary, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb fell. Around 40,000 people died instantly. Critically low on fuel, the boxcar made an emergency landing in Okinawa, its special propellers helping slow the plane on the short runway. 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki on August 15, 1945, the Emperor of Japan announced his nation's unconditional surrender. The war was over. The B-29 superfortress, the $3 billion gamble, had delivered the final decisive blows.
Nice.
The legacy of the B-29 is, to put it mildly, complicated. On one hand, it was an absolute triumph of engineering, an aircraft of breathtaking innovation that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The pressurized cabins, the computerized guns, the sheer scale of its performance, these were leaps in technology that would shape aviation for decades. For the engineers who built it and the crews who flew it, the B-29 was a symbol of genius and might, the weapon that ended a brutal war. But there is another, much darker side to its story. For the people of Japan, the B-29 was not a marvel. It was a silver ghost in the night sky, a harbinger of fire and death. It was the instrument of a bombing campaign that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and left millions homeless. And of course, the B-29 will forever be the plane that carried the atomic bomb, a permanent fixture in the terrifying new world it helped create. After World War II, the superfortress continued to serve, flying missions in the Korean War before it was finally retired. Its design DNA was passed down to the next generation of bombers, like the B-52 Stratofortress, carrying its legacy deep into the Cold War. Today, only a handful of these incredible aircraft still exist. Only 2, Fifi and Doc, are still flying, kept in the air by dedicated volunteers as living museums. They are a powerful, tangible link to a time of both incredible innovation and incredible violence. The story of the B-29 is a story of duality. It's about a technological wonder that even its own crews couldn't quite believe. A game changer that solved an impossible problem. But it's also a sobering reminder that the same human ingenuity that creates wonders can also be harnessed to create unparalleled destruction. It was and remains the ultimate double-edged sword of the Second World War.